You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Vera Hollis. I'm 43 years old, and I live in Boise, Idaho. I've been doing the van thing for about 8 months when this happened. Just me and my beat-up 2006 Dodge Sprinter that I got off Craigslist for way too much money. The whole Vanlife thing wasn't some Instagram dream for me. I lost my job during the pandemic and figured why pay rent when I could just drive around, you know? So anyway, I was heading through Kansas in late October, trying to get to Missouri before the weather turned completely awful. I've been driving for like 6 hours straight and my back was killing me. So when I saw this exit for someplace called Bazine, population maybe 300 people, I figured I'd pull off and find a spot to crash for the night. The sun was already going down, and I hate driving in the dark on these country roads. I passed through the actual town in about 40 seconds, just a gas station and a couple houses that looked half dead, and kept going another mile or so until I found what looked like an old rest stop that nobody used anymore. The place was pretty creepy, I'm not gonna lie. There were these concrete picnic tables all cracked and covered in graffiti, and the bathroom building had boards over the windows. But I've parked in worse places, and at least there were some trees around, so my van wasn't just sitting out in the open on the side of the highway. I pulled into the far corner of the parking lot, away from the road, and that's when I noticed the other vehicle. It was this old RV, probably from the 70s or 80s, with faded brown stripes and rust eating through the bottom panels. The windows were all dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I sat there for a minute trying to decide if I should just keep driving, but honestly I was so tired and my options were pretty limited. The next town was another 30 miles, and who knew if there'd be anywhere to park there either. So I convinced myself it was fine, probably just another person like me trying to get some sleep, and I backed my van into a spot on the opposite side of the lot. I made myself some ramen on my little camping stove, scrolled through my phone for a bit even though the signal was garbage, and tried to relax. The whole time, though, I kept glancing over at that RV, and I never saw any movement. No lights, nothing. Around 10 o'clock, I finally decided to try and sleep. I locked all my doors, double-checked them actually, and crawled into my sleeping bag in the back. That's when I started hearing it. This weird scratching sound, like something metal being dragged across concrete. It would go for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind or an animal or something, but it had this rhythm to it that seemed too deliberate. I tried to ignore it and just focus on falling asleep, but every time I'd start to drift off, there it was again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And it seemed like it was getting closer. I must have laid there for like an hour just listening to that sound, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But here's the thing. When you're alone in a van in the middle of nowhere, every little noise gets into your head, you know? I finally grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointed it out the back window toward where the sound was coming from. I couldn't see anything except the dark outline of those concrete picnic tables and some trash blowing around. The scratching had stopped the second I turned on the light though, which somehow made it worse. I turned off my phone to save battery and just sat there in the dark, listening so hard my ears actually hurt. That's when I heard footsteps, and these weren't like animal sounds or whatever. These were definitely boots on pavement, slow and heavy. They walked past my van on the driver's side, and I held my breath, trying not to move at all. My van's got those tinted windows in the back, but the front windshield is pretty exposed, and I was terrified whoever was would look inside and see me crouched there like an idiot. The footsteps stopped right by my door, and I swear I stopped breathing completely. Then I heard a voice, and this is the part that still messes me up when I think about it. It was a man's voice, kind of quiet and raspy, and he said, "I know you're in there." Just like that, super calm. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stayed frozen in my sleeping bag with my heart going absolutely crazy. After what felt like forever, but was probably only like 30 seconds, the footsteps started up again and moved away toward the bathroom building. I very slowly lifted my head up enough to peek out the front window, and I could see this figure, definitely a man, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or hoodie, walking toward those boarded up bathrooms. Here's where I should have just started the van and gotten the hell out of there, right? But I don't know, maybe I was in shock or something because I just kept watching. The guy disappeared around the side of the bathroom building and didn't come back out. I waited there for probably 20 minutes, watching and listening, but nothing. No more footsteps, no more scratching, just silence and the occasional sound of wind. My brain started doing that thing where it tries to rationalize everything. Maybe he was just another homeless person. Maybe he was messing with me, but didn't actually mean any harm. Maybe I should just go back to sleep and everything would be fine in the morning. Obviously, that was stupid thinking, but when you're exhausted and scared, your brain does weird stuff. I actually started to relax a little bit, convinced myself the guy was probably sleeping in the bathroom building or had walked off into the woods or whatever. I was just about to lie back down when I saw movement by the old RV I'd noticed earlier. The door was opening slowly, like someone was being really careful not to make noise, and another figure stepped out. This one was smaller, maybe a woman, and she just stood there next to the RV looking in my direction. She stood there for so long, without moving, that I started wondering if I was actually seeing things, if maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. Then she started walking toward my van, and that's when I knew something was really, really wrong. Her walk was weird, kind of stiff and unnatural, and even though I couldn't see her face, I could tell she was staring right at where I was. I scrambled into the driver's seat, keys already in my shaking hand, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood go cold. There were wet footprints on my windshield from the inside. Someone had been in my van while I was parked before I'd even gotten in it, and they climbed out through the front, and I never even noticed. I turned the key, and the engine made this horrible grinding sound but didn't start, and I'm sitting there pumping the gas and turning it again while this woman is getting closer and closer to my van. On the third try, it finally caught and roared to life, and I threw it in drive and just gunned it out of that parking lot without even looking where I was going. I heard something hit the side of my van, maybe her hand or maybe just a branch, I don't know, but I didn't stop to check. I just drove. My headlights were bouncing all over the place as I flew down this access road back toward the highway, and in my rearview mirror, I could see the parking lot lit up by my taillights. Both of them were standing there now, the man and the woman, just watching me leave, not running after me or anything, just standing there. And then I saw a third person come out of the bathroom building and a fourth one from behind the RV, and I realized there had been a whole group of them there the entire time, just waiting. I hit the highway doing probably 60 and didn't slow down until I was a good 10 miles away. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel, and I kept checking my mirrors every few seconds expecting to see headlights following me. But the road stayed empty. I drove for another hour before I finally pulled into a well-lit truck stop outside of some town called La Crosse. There were like 20 other vehicles there, security cameras, a 24-hour convenience store, basically the complete opposite of where I'd been. I parked right under a light pole and got out to check my van, and that's when I saw what had made that scratching sound I'd been hearing. Someone had carved words into the metal side of my van with something sharp, probably a screwdriver or a knife. The letters were rough and crooked, but you could read them clear enough. Come back soon. And underneath that, there were tally marks, 23 of them, all scratched into my paint. I stood there staring at those marks, trying to figure out what they meant, and then it hit me. Those were probably other people who'd stopped at that rest stop, other vans or RVs or whatever. 23 people before me. I went into the truck stop bathroom and splashed water on my face, tried to calm down and think straight. I should call the police, right? Tell them what happened. But what would I even say? That some people at a rest stop scared me? That someone carved words on my van? I didn't have any proof of anything really dangerous. And knowing how cops are in these small towns, they probably think I was on drugs or crazy or both. Plus, those footprints on my windshield were gone now. I'd run the wipers when I was trying to get away, and they'd smeared into nothing. I spent the rest of that night in my van at the truck stop, doors locked, barely sleeping. Every time a semi would pull in or someone would walk by, I'd jolt awake in a panic. When the sun finally came up, I checked Google Maps to see if I could find that rest stop again, see if there was any information about it online. I found it. It was called the Bazine Rest Area, and according to the state records, it had been officially closed since 2008 due to budget cuts and safety concerns. The satellite view showed the exact parking lot I'd been in, the bathroom building, everything. But when I zoomed in on Street View from the highway, there was a big orange sign posted at the entrance that said closed and no trespassing. I sat in that truck stop for most of the morning, drinking terrible coffee and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just forget the whole thing and keep driving east, put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about those tally marks, about what they might mean. 23 marks. 23 people. What happened to them? Were they okay? Did they get away like I did? Or did something worse happen? I ended up doing something probably pretty stupid. I went back. Not to the rest stop itself, but to the actual town of Bazine. I figured if weird stuff was happening at that closed rest area, maybe somebody in town knew about it. I pulled into the gas station I'd passed the night before and went inside. There was this older guy behind the counter, probably in his 60s, with a Kansas City Chiefs cap and a beard that looked like he'd been growing it since Vietnam. I bought a pack of gum I didn't want and tried to sound casual when I asked him about the old rest stop. The change in his expression was immediate. His whole face just kind of closed off, you know? He looked at me for a long second and then said, "We didn't stop there, did you?" Well, I didn't answer right away. He shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Then he told me that people from town don't go near that place anymore, haven't for years. He said back in 2007 or 2008, there was this group of people, he called them squatters, but the way he said it made them sound like something worse, who took over the rest area after the state closed it. The county sheriff tried to clear them out a few times, but they kept coming back. Then he told me about a couple from Minnesota who'd been driving through in 2009, stopped at the rest area not knowing it was closed. They were found 2 days later in their RV about 15 miles away, both of them dead. The official report said carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater, but people in town thought different. The guy behind the counter leaned in closer and said the couple's RV had been completely cleaned out. All their stuff gone, luggage, money, everything. And there were marks on their bodies, bruises and cuts that didn't match any carbon monoxide story. The whole thing got swept under the rug though, because the state didn't want the bad publicity. He told me there were other incidents too, over the years. People who stopped there and disappeared for a few days, then turned up confused and missing time, couldn't remember what happened. A trucker in 2011 who said he was held in the bathroom building for 6 hours by a group of people who never spoke, just watched him. Nobody believed most of these stories. They sounded too crazy, like urban legends or whatever. But enough weird stuff happened that eventually the state put up better signs and barriers, and most people knew to avoid the place. Except apparently the signs weren't enough to stop people like me who were just tired and not paying attention. I asked him why the police didn't do more about it, why they didn't just arrest whoever was squatting there. He gave me this look like I was missing something obvious and said, "They tried. You can't arrest people you can't find." He said the sheriff's department went out there with like 8 deputies in 2010, planning to clear the place out once and for all. They searched every building, every vehicle, every inch of those woods around the rest stop. Found absolutely nobody. No people, no evidence anyone had been there recently, nothing. But then 3 days later, someone else reported seeing people there again, coming and going like they'd never left. I walked out of that gas station feeling sick to my stomach, and I made a decision right there in the parking lot. I was going to the sheriff's department and telling them what happened to me, showing them the scratches on my van, everything. Maybe they wouldn't believe me, but at least it would be on record. The sheriff's office was in a slightly bigger town about 20 minutes away, and when I got there and told my story to the deputy at the front desk, she just sighed like she'd heard all before. She took my information and photos of my van, and said someone would follow up if they needed more details. That was it. No urgency, no concern, just bureaucratic processing. I left Kansas that same day, and I didn't stop driving until I was completely out of the state. Made it all the way to Columbia, Missouri before I felt safe enough to park for the night, and even then I chose a Walmart parking lot with like 50 other RVs and vans around. But here's the thing that's messed me up ever since. About a week after I left Kansas, I was going through my van trying to organize my stuff, and I found something that wasn't mine. It was tucked under the passenger seat, wrapped in an old piece of newspaper. It was a small leather journal, the kind you can buy at any craft store, with a rubber band holding it closed. My hands were shaking when I opened it, because somehow I knew it was going to be bad. The pages were filled with names, dates, and license plate numbers. Dozens of them going back years. Some entries had little notes next to them. Fought back, easy couple, family. The most recent entry was dated the night before I'd stopped at that rest stop, and it was a Kansas plate number I didn't recognize. The entry before that, 3 days earlier, was also from Kansas. And then I found mine. My name, Vera Hollis. My license plate number, the date. And next to it, just 2 words, got away. Seeing my own name written in someone else's handwriting in that journal made me feel violated in a way I can't even really describe. But what made it so much worse was that whoever put this journal in my van had been inside it again after I escaped. Maybe at that truck stop where I spent the night, or maybe at some other stop along the way. They'd gotten in without me knowing, left this thing for me to find, and gotten back out like it was nothing. I drove straight to the nearest police station. This was in Missouri now, and turned the journal over to them. Told them the whole story, showed them the scratches on my van, everything. The cops actually seemed to take it seriously this time, probably because I had physical evidence. They said they'd contact Kansas authorities and follow up on the names in the journal, try to track down those people and see if they were okay. I gave them my phone number and email, and they said they'd be in touch. That was 4 months ago, and I haven't heard anything. I've called twice, and both times they said the investigation was ongoing. I still live in my van because honestly, I don't have a lot of other options right now, but I don't drive through Kansas anymore. I don't stop at rest areas at all if I can help it, and I definitely don't park anywhere isolated or abandoned. I stick to truck stops, Walmarts, busy places with lots of lights and people. I also installed better locks on my van and a battery-powered security camera that records to a memory card. So far, I haven't seen anyone trying to break in again, but I check that footage every single morning just in case. Sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I think about those 23 tally marks scratched in my van, and I wonder how many of those people are still alive. I wonder if any of them found journals in their vehicles too, or if I was special somehow. And I think about the guy at the gas station saying you can't arrest people you can't find, and how that group just keeps coming back no matter how many times they're chased away. I think about how many other closed rest areas there might be across the country, how many other places where people can just disappear and nobody really looks that hard for answers. The worst part is knowing they're still out there, still waiting at that rest stop for the next tired driver who doesn't notice the signs, who just wants a place to sleep for a few hours. Still keeping count with their tally marks, still collecting names in their journals. And there's nothing I can do about it except tell my story and hope that maybe, just maybe, it keeps someone else from making the same mistake I did. But honestly, I don't think most people would believe me anyway. I barely believe it myself sometimes, and I was there. I lived it. I've got the scratches on my van to prove it. My name is Donald Pritchett. I'm 58 years old, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. Well, I used to live there full-time anyway. My wife Margaret and I sold our house about a year and a half ago and bought this 1998 Winnebago Rialta that we fixed up ourselves. The thing was a piece of junk when we got it, but we spent 6 months rebuilding the interior, new flooring, new appliances, the whole deal. Margaret wanted to see the country before we got too old to enjoy it. And honestly, after 35 years of working construction, I was ready for a change. We've been on the road for about 9 months when this happened, mostly sticking to the Southwest and California, but in July we decided to head up north where it was cooler. We made it up through Nevada and into Oregon, and let me tell you, Oregon in the summer is absolutely beautiful, nothing like the desert heat we were used to. We've been following this route we found online that took us through all these small towns and scenic areas, real off-the-beaten path type stuff. That's how we ended up near this little place called Lakeview, which is way up in the south-central part of the state near the California border. Margaret had read about this lake called Heart Lake on some camping forum, said it was supposed to be gorgeous and really peaceful. The forum post mentioned you could camp right on the shore for free as long as you were on public land, which sounded perfect to us since we're trying to stretch our retirement money. We drove out there following GPS directions down this dirt road that got narrower and narrower until I was worried we'd get stuck, but eventually it opened up to this absolutely stunning view. The lake was this deep blue color and there wasn't another person in sight, just sagebrush and hills all around. We found a flat spot about 50 yards from the water and set up for the night. It was late afternoon by then, maybe 5 or 6 o'clock, and Margaret started making dinner while I got our camping chairs out. That's when I noticed the other RV parked on the far side of the lake, maybe a quarter-mile away. It was one of those big Class A motorhomes, looked pretty new and expensive, white with blue stripes. I pointed it out to Margaret, and she said, well, at least we're not completely alone out here if something happens. At the time, it seemed like a good thing. We ate dinner watching the sunset over the lake. I gotta say, it was one of those perfect moments that made all the hassle of van life worth it. The sky turned orange and pink, and the whole lake just glowed. Absolutely beautiful. We were sitting there finishing our beers when we saw someone walking along the shoreline from the direction of that other RV. It was a man, looked maybe 50 or so, wearing khaki pants and a fishing vest. He waved at us real friendly-like and started heading our way. He introduced himself as Robert something. I honestly can't remember his last name now, and said he and his wife had been camping there for a few days. Super friendly guy, asked us where we were from, how long we'd been traveling, all the usual RV small talk. He mentioned they were from Washington State, retired school teachers, doing the same thing we were. Margaret invited him to sit down and have a beer with us, and we ended up talking for probably an hour about different places we'd all been, comparing routes and campgrounds. The whole time, though, something felt just slightly off about him. He kept asking really specific questions about our plans, like where exactly we were heading next, what route we were taking, how long we usually stayed in one spot. Margaret didn't seem to notice anything weird. She was just enjoying the conversation, but I've always been kind of suspicious of people who ask too many questions. Robert eventually headed back to his RV as it was getting dark, said his wife Helen would love to meet us tomorrow, and maybe we could have breakfast together. We said sure, that'd be nice, and watched him walk back along the shore with his flashlight. Once he was gone, Margaret said, wasn't that lovely, meeting such nice people? And I agreed, even though I still had this nagging feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on. We turned in around 10 o'clock, which is early for us, but we've been driving all day and we're pretty beat. Our RV has this setup where the bed is in the back, kind of separated from the main area by a curtain, and we've got windows on both sides, plus a skylight. I like being able to see out at night. Makes me feel less closed in, you know? I was just starting to doze off when I heard an engine start up. I figured it was Robert and Helen leaving, which seemed weird since it was pretty late, but then the engine sound faded away toward the road instead of past our RV. Somebody else had been parked out there that we hadn't even seen. I got up and looked out the window, but couldn't see any taillights or anything. It was too dark. Margaret mumbled something about coming back to bed, and I did, but I had trouble falling asleep after that. Around midnight, I heard again, another engine, this one sounding different, maybe a truck. It drove past on the dirt road behind us, going slow, and I could see the glow of headlights moving across our ceiling. The vehicle stopped somewhere past us, the engine shut off, and then nothing. Just silence. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew it was getting light out and Margaret was already up making coffee. I felt groggy and weird, like I hadn't really rested, and when I looked out the window toward the lake, I saw something that made me feel even worse. There were now 4 RVs and motorhomes parked around the lake, instead of just the 2 from yesterday. I asked Margaret if she'd heard more vehicles coming in during the night, and she said no, she'd slept like a rock. But there they were, 2 on the far side near Robert's RV, and 1 more on our side, maybe 100 yards away. Margaret said, well, I guess word got out about this spot. It's not that surprising on a nice summer weekend. But it wasn't the weekend, it was a Wednesday, and something about all these RVs showing up in the middle of the night just felt wrong. I walked down to the lake to fill our water containers. We had a filter for the lake water since we were running low, and while I was crouched there, I saw someone come out of one of the new RVs. It was a woman, younger than us, maybe 40, and she was just standing there staring in my direction. Not waving, not moving, just staring. I waved at her, trying to be friendly, and she didn't react at all. Just turned around and went back inside. When I got back to our RV, Margaret was talking to someone outside. It was Robert again, and this time he had his wife Helen with him. Helen was a short woman with gray hair and a smile that showed too many teeth, and she immediately started going on about how wonderful it was to have neighbors, and how they'd love to have us over for breakfast. Margaret had already agreed before I could say anything, and honestly it seemed rude to back out at that point. So we walked over to their RV, which turned out to be even nicer inside than it looked from outside. Granite countertops, leather seats, flat screen TV, the works. Helen made us pancakes and bacon and kept refilling our coffee cups, talking nonstop about their travels and their grandkids and just every random thing you could think of. Robert was quieter this morning, kind of letting his wife do all the talking, but every so often I'd catch him watching me with this expression I couldn't read. We were just finishing breakfast when there was a knock on their door, and Robert got up to answer it. It was the woman I'd seen earlier, the one who'd been staring at me from across the lake. She stepped inside without being invited and looked around at all of us like she was counting us. Then she said to Robert, "So these are the new ones?" And Robert nodded. Margaret laughed kind of nervously and said, "New what?" And the woman just smiled and said, "New arrivals, new campers." She introduced herself as Patricia and said she and her husband were parked on the west side. Helen offered her coffee, but Patricia said no, she just wanted to meet us, and then she left just as abruptly as she'd come. The whole interaction took maybe 90 seconds, and it was the most uncomfortable 90 seconds I'd experienced in a while. Margaret tried to laugh it off, made some joke about how people get weird when they're camping alone too long, but I could tell she was rattled too. We thanked Robert and Helen for breakfast and headed back to our RV, and on the way I counted the vehicles around the lake again. There were 6 now, 6 RVs and motorhomes, all parked in this rough circle around the lake like they were surrounding it. And I hadn't heard a single engine since the ones during the night. These vehicles had just appeared, silent as ghosts. Back at our RV, I told Margaret I thought we should pack up and leave, head into town, or find another campsite. She asked why, and I didn't really have a good answer except that something felt wrong. And she said, "Don, you're being paranoid. These are just other campers enjoying the lake." But I could see in her eyes that she was uneasy too. We compromised. We'd stay the rest of the day, but leave first thing in the morning. Margaret wanted to swim in the lake since it was already getting hot, and I figured, what's the harm? We're leaving tomorrow anyway. She went down to the water, and I stayed by the RV, pretending to read a book, but really just watching the other campsites. Over the next hour, I saw people come out of the various RVs, different people, different ages, but they all had this same weird behavior. They'd stand outside their vehicle for a few minutes, just looking around, then go back inside. None of them went swimming, even though it was probably 85 degrees already. None of them set up chairs or fishing poles or did any of the normal camping stuff. They just watched. Around 2 in the afternoon, Robert came walking over again. He said he and some of the other campers were going to have a potluck dinner tonight, and would we like to join them? I was about to say no thanks when Margaret said, "Oh, that sounds lovely. We'll bring our famous potato salad." I shot her a look, but she ignored it. Robert seemed really pleased and said great. They'd set everything up around 7 o'clock in the clearing between the RVs on the north side. After he left, I asked Margaret what the hell she was thinking. We agreed we were leaving tomorrow. Why get more involved with these people? She said, "It's just dinner, Dawn. Stop being so antisocial. You're always complaining I don't try to make friends on the road." We spent the afternoon in this weird, tense silence. Margaret making her potato salad, and me doing busy work around the RV that didn't really need doing. I kept finding excuses to look out the windows, watching those other campers, and the more I watched, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. At one point, I saw 3 of them standing in a group between 2 RVs, and they were all looking down at something on the ground. I grabbed our binoculars and focused in, and what I saw made my stomach turn. They were looking at a map, and on that map, they'd marked locations with red pins. I couldn't see details, but I could see enough to know they were marking campsites or roads or something like that. Around 6:30, Margaret changed into a nicer shirt and put on lipstick, which she never does when we're camping, and she picked up the bowl of potato salad and said, "Come on, let's go." I followed her, but I brought my pocket knife with me, the one I carry for cutting rope or opening packages, and I made sure it was in my front pocket where I could reach it easy. The walk to the clearing took maybe 5 minutes, and when we got there, I counted 12 people total, not including us. 12 people, 6 RVs. Everyone had brought food, and they'd set it all out on a folding table someone had provided. The whole thing felt like a stage play, Like everyone was acting normal, but following a script they'd memorized. People introduced themselves. There was Patricia and her husband James, a couple named Steve and Linda, an older single guy named Carl, and a few others whose names I forgot immediately. They all asked us the same questions Robert had asked: where we were from, where we were going, how long we'd been traveling. Margaret was eating it up, laughing and chatting like she was at a church social, but I noticed that nobody was really eating the food. They put stuff on their plates, but just sat there. After about 30 minutes of this, Robert stood up and cleared his throat, and everyone got quiet. He said he wanted to welcome us properly to their little community, and that they had a tradition when new people joined them. Margaret squeezed my hand like this was so sweet, and I felt sick. Robert continued, said that everyone there had been traveling for a long time, seen a lot of the country, but eventually they'd all found their way to this lake. And once you found it, once you understood what it meant, you didn't really want to leave. You wanted to stay and help others find it too. I stood up and said thanks for the dinner, but we're actually heading out early tomorrow, and Robert's smile got wider. He said, "Oh, we don't think you'll be leaving tomorrow, Dawn. We think you'll want to stay a while." See, the thing about this place is that it has a way of keeping the people it needs. Margaret was looking confused now, looking between me and Robert, and she said, "What's going on? What are you talking about?" Helen stood up then and walked over to Margaret, put her hand on Margaret's shoulder in this gentle way that somehow seemed threatening, and said, "Don't worry, dear. You'll understand soon enough." That's when I grabbed Margaret's hand and said, "We're leaving right now." I pulled her toward the path back to our RV, and nobody tried to stop us. They just watched us go with these calm expressions like they knew something we didn't. We practically ran back to our RV, and I immediately started unhooking our water and power, getting ready to drive out of there. Margaret was crying, asking me what just happened, and I didn't have an answer except that we needed to leave immediately. I got in the driver's seat and turned the key, and the engine made a clicking sound but didn't start. I tried again. Same thing. Dead battery, or something worse. I got out and popped the hood, and my hand was shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. I checked the battery connections, and they were fine, but when I looked closer I saw that someone had pulled the main fuse to the starter. Just plucked it right out. I looked around at the other RVs, and I could see people standing outside them now, all of them facing our direction, just standing there in the growing darkness. Margaret came around to the front and saw my face and said, "What is it?" And I said, "They disabled our RV. We can't leave." She started hyperventilating, and I had to get her back inside and calm her down. We locked all the doors and windows, and I pulled the curtains shut, and we sat there in the dark trying to figure out what to do. Margaret wanted to call 911, but when we checked our phones, we had no service, not even one bar. I kicked myself for not checking that earlier, for not insisting we leave when I first felt something was off. We were stuck there with these people who clearly had some kind of weird cult thing going on, and nobody knew where we were. I told my brother we were heading to Oregon, but I hadn't been specific about where. Around 9 o'clock, we heard footsteps outside the RV, and then Robert's voice saying, "Dawn, Margaret, we need to talk." I told him to go away, leave us alone, and he said he understood we were scared, but there was no reason to be. He said they just wanted us to stay for a few days, get to know the place, understand what they'd all found here. He made it sound so reasonable, like we were being irrational. I yelled at him that he sabotaged our RV, and that's not how normal people make friends, and he went quiet for a minute. Then he said they'd put the fuse back in the morning if we still wanted to leave, but he really hoped we'd stay. Margaret and I took turns staying awake that night, one of us always watching through a gap in the curtains. Around 3 in the morning during my watch, I saw something that I still can't explain. All 12 of those people came out of their RVs at the exact same time, like they'd coordinated it, and they walked down to the lake in single file. They stood at the water's edge for maybe 10 minutes, not moving, not talking, just standing there. Then they all turned around in unison and walked back to their RVs. The whole thing was so creepy and choreographed that I had to bite my tongue to keep from making noise. When the sun came up, I went outside and checked under the hood. The fuse was back in place, like Robert had promised. I didn't trust it, but I got in and tried the engine, and it started right up. Margaret was already packed and ready to go. She'd been stuffing things in bags since first light. I didn't bother unhooking properly, just disconnected the essentials and got us moving. As we drove past the other RVs heading toward the road, people came outside to watch us. They weren't angry or upset. They just stood there with these peaceful expressions, and Patricia actually waved. We drove straight through to the nearest town with a sheriff's office, which turned out to be Lakeview itself, about 40 minutes away. We told the deputy at the desk everything that had happened. The weird questions, the disabled RV, the midnight gathering at the lake, all of it. He listened and took notes and said he'd send someone out to check on things. He also mentioned that they'd had reports about that lake before, people camping there and having strange experiences, but whenever they investigated, they never found anything unusual. He said it was probably just people who liked their privacy and we'd misunderstood the situation. But here's the thing that made me certain we'd stumbled into something really messed up. When we were driving away from the lake, I'd checked the odometer to see how far we'd gone, and it was exactly 4.2 miles from where we'd been camped to the main highway. The next day, after we'd reported everything to the sheriff, I looked up Heart Lake on Google Maps. The lake exists, it's a real place in Oregon, but according to the satellite imagery, there's no road accessing it from the south like we'd taken. The only road goes in from the north, and it's marked as closed due to washout damage from 2019. The place we'd been, that dirt road we'd followed, the perfect camping spot with the blue water, none of it matched the actual geography of Heart Lake. I don't know if we were at Heart Lake at all, or if we were somewhere else entirely that those people had somehow directed us to. All I know is that we got out, and based on that map I'd seen them studying with all those red pins, there were probably a lot of people who didn't. Margaret doesn't want to talk about it anymore, says it was just a weird misunderstanding and we're safe now, so let's move on. But I've been looking at missing persons reports for that area of Oregon, and over the past 5 years there have been at least 8 cases of people vanishing while camping or traveling through that region. 8 people, all of them in RVs or vans, all of them last seen heading toward the backcountry around Lakeview. We don't camp in isolated spots anymore, and we definitely don't follow random camping recommendations from internet forums. We stick to established campgrounds with hosts and other people around, places where you can't just disappear without anyone noticing. And sometimes late at night, I'll wake up and look out the window, half expecting to see those 12 people standing in a circle around our RV, waiting patiently for us to understand what they try to show us, waiting for us to come back and join their little community by that impossible lake that maybe doesn't even exist on any real map. My name is Iris Dalton. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Durham, North Carolina. I've been doing the van thing for about 5 months when this happened, mostly because I work remotely as a graphic designer and figured why not save money on rent and see the country while I'm at it. My van is just a basic Ford Transit I bought used, nothing fancy, but I put in a bed platform and some storage, and it works fine for what I need. I'm not one of those Instagram van life people with a perfect setup and the fairy lights. I'm just trying to live cheap and have some freedom. So I was driving up north in late September, heading from North Carolina to visit a friend in upstate New York, and I'd planned to make it a 2-day drive with an overnight somewhere in Pennsylvania. I've been on the road for about 7 hours and it was getting dark, maybe 8:30 or 9, and I was going through this area of Pennsylvania that was all small towns that looked like they'd been dying slowly since the 80s. You know the type, empty storefronts, houses that needed paint, churches that probably had more ghosts than congregation. I went through a few of these towns, and they all kind of blurred together until I got to this one place called Carbondale. Carbondale looked like all the others, except slightly less depressing, and I was getting tired enough that I needed to find somewhere to park for the night. I've got this app on my phone that shows safe parking spots, but the nearest Walmart or truck stop was another 40 minutes away, and I just didn't have it in me to keep driving. So I started looking for a quiet residential street where I could park without bothering anyone. I've done this plenty of times before, and usually nobody cares as long as you're not blasting music or leaving trash everywhere. I found this neighborhood on the east side of town that looked perfect, older houses, most of them well-maintained, big trees, the kind of street where people probably went to bed early and minded their own business. There was this spot between 2 streetlights where it was a little darker, and I pulled in and killed the engine. I sat there for a few minutes just checking out the area, making sure I wasn't blocking any driveways or parked in front of a house that looked like the owners would freak out. Everything seemed fine. There were lights on in most of the houses, and I could see TVs flickering through windows, just normal evening stuff. I made myself some dinner, just ramen and crackers, because I hadn't gone grocery shopping in a few days, and scrolled through my phone. The cell service was decent, which was nice, and I texted my friend Sarah to let her know I'd probably be at her place by tomorrow afternoon. Around 10:30, I brushed my teeth using my water jug and spit into a bottle like you do in a van, changed into my sleep clothes, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The street was pretty quiet, just the occasional car passing by, and I figured I'd get a solid night's sleep. I woke up maybe an hour later to the sound of a door closing, and when you're sleeping in a van, you get kind of sensitive to sounds outside. I peeked through my curtain and saw a man coming out of the house directly across from where I was parked. He was maybe 50 years old, wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and he walked to his car in the driveway, got in, and just sat there with the interior light on. He wasn't on his phone or doing anything really, just sitting there staring straight ahead. After about 5 minutes he got out, went back in his house, and the lights went off. Weird, but whatever. Maybe he forgot something or was checking on his car. About 20 minutes later, it happened again, but this time it was a different house 3 doors down. A woman came out, got in her car, sat there for a few minutes with the dome light on, then went back inside. Then, maybe 15 minutes after that, another person from another house did the exact same thing. I started to wonder if this was some kind of neighborhood watch thing, like maybe they'd noticed my van and were checking to make sure I wasn't casing the place for a robbery or something. But if that was it, why wouldn't they just come knock on my window and ask what I was doing there? I decided to stay awake and watch, because now I was curious and also a little bit nervous. Over the next hour, I counted 6 different people from 6 different houses doing this exact same routine. Come out, get in car, sit there staring ahead for a few minutes, go back inside. None of them looked at my van. None of them looked at each other's houses. They just stared straight ahead like they were in a trance or something. The whole thing was giving me serious creepy vibes, and I was starting to think I should just leave and drive to that Walmart, even though I was tired. But then everything went quiet again, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Probably they were all just insomniacs or night shift workers doing whatever weird routine they had. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept waking up every time I heard a sound outside. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to voices, and this time I cracked my window a tiny bit so I could hear better. There were at least 3 or 4 people standing in the street between my van and the houses across from me, talking in low voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, like they were arguing about something or trying to make a decision. I stayed completely still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, hoping they'd finish their conversation and go away. But instead, the voices got closer, and I realized they were walking toward my van. I heard footsteps right outside my driver's side door, and then someone tried the handle. I always lock my doors when I sleep, but feeling that handle move while I'm laying there in the dark was absolutely terrifying. The person tried it twice, then moved to the back doors and tried those too. I had my phone in my hand ready to call 911, but I was afraid that if they heard me talking they might break a window or something. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2, the footsteps moved away and the voices got quieter. I very carefully lifted my head up enough to peek out the front window, and I saw 4 people walking back to their houses. They split up at the sidewalk, each going to a different house, and disappeared inside. I waited another 10 minutes to make sure they weren't coming back. Then I scrambled into the driver's seat and started the engine. I didn't care how tired I was anymore. I needed to get out of that neighborhood. But here's where it gets really messed up. When I turned the key, nothing happened. Not even a clicking sound, just complete silence. My battery was dead. Well, something was wrong with the starter, I don't know. I'd just driven a van like 3 hours earlier and it had been fine, and now suddenly it wouldn't start at all. I tried it 4 or 5 times, pumping the gas, jiggling the key, all the stuff you try when a car won't start, but nothing worked. I was stuck there on that street with people who just tried to get into my van, and I had no way to leave. I sat there in the driver's seat, trying not to panic and trying to figure out what to do. My phone still had service, so I pulled up Google and searched for 24-hour towing in Carbondale. But the only result was a company whose voicemail said they'd open at 7 a.m. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Some people tried my door handle, and now my van won't start? They probably think I was crazy or on drugs or something. So I decided I'd just have to wait it out until morning, stay awake and alert, and deal with getting the van fixed once the sun came up. The next couple hours were the longest of my life, I swear. I kept watching through my windows, jumping at every little sound, convinced that any second those people were going to come back. Around 4 in the morning, I saw lights start coming on in different houses, and I thought, okay, people are waking up, getting ready for work, everything's going to be normal now. But what happened instead was that people started coming outside and gathering in small groups on the sidewalk. Not like they were heading to their cars to go to work, more like they were congregating intentionally. I counted maybe 12 or 15 people total, all adults ranging from probably 30 to 60 years old, and they were all just standing there in these little clusters talking quietly. Every so often one of them would glance in my direction, and I'd duck down below the window so they couldn't see me watching. This went on for maybe 20 minutes, and then one of them, an older woman with white hair wearing a bathrobe, started walking toward my van. She came right up to the driver's side window and knocked on it, and I about had a heart attack. I cracked the window maybe an inch and said, "Yes, can I help you?" trying to sound normal and not completely terrified. She smiled at me, this really warm grandmotherly smile, and said, "Honey, is your vehicle having trouble?" I said, "Yeah, it won't start. I'm waiting for a tow truck when they open." She said, "Oh, that's terrible. Why don't you come inside and have some coffee while you wait? You must be freezing out here." And you know what? Part of me actually considered it because I was freezing and exhausted and the idea of hot coffee sounded amazing. But the bigger part of me was screaming that something was very wrong with this whole situation. I told her, "No, thank you. I'm fine. I'll just wait here." Her smile didn't change at all, and she said, "Well, if you change your mind, I'm right there in the blue house, number 42. Then she leaned a little closer and said, "You know, we don't get many visitors on this street. Most people who come here end up staying a while." And the way she said it, it wasn't welcoming or friendly, it was threatening. Like she was telling me that I didn't have a choice. I didn't respond, just roll my window back up and lock the doors again, even though they were already locked. She stood there for another minute, just looking at me through the glass, still smiling, then finally turned and walked back to join the others. They all talked for a few more minutes, kept looking over at my van, and then slowly dispersed back to their houses. By 5 a.m., the street was empty again and quiet, like nothing had happened. I tried my van one more time, just in case, and of course it still didn't start. I was stuck there until the tow truck could come, which meant another 2 hours minimum of sitting in this neighborhood with these weird people who apparently didn't sleep and had some kind of obsession with visitors. As soon as it was 7 o'clock, I called that towing company, and the guy who answered sounded half asleep. I explained my situation, told him the address where I was parked, and there was this pause on the line. Then he asked me to repeat the street name, and when I did, he said, "Listen, lady, I don't know who put you up to this, but I'm not sending a truck to Ash Street." I asked him why not, and he just said that street's bad news, find another way out of there, and hung up on me. I called back 3 times, and he wouldn't answer. So now I was really starting to freak out, because what kind of street is so bad that a tow truck driver won't even go there? I searched online for any information about Ash Street in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, and I found a few things that made my blood run cold. There was a forum post from 2018 where someone asked if anyone knew what happened on Ash Street, and the responses were vague but disturbing. One person said their cousin used to live there and just disappeared one day, left all their stuff behind, and was never heard from again. Another person said the police don't go there anymore unless absolutely necessary, because the last time they responded to a call, 2 officers went missing for 16 hours and came back acting strange. I found a news article from 2015 about a young couple who'd gone missing while traveling through northeastern Pennsylvania, and their van was found abandoned on Ash Street. The couple was never found. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just an empty van with all their belongings still inside. The article mentioned that Carbondale police had investigated but found nothing, and eventually the case went cold. I looked at the photo of the van in the article, and my heart almost stopped. It was parked in almost the exact same spot where I was parked right now. I was about to call 911. Consequences be damned when I saw movement outside. People were coming out of their houses again, but this time there were more of them. I counted at least 25 or 30 people, including some I hadn't seen before. They weren't clustering in small groups this time. They were forming a line across the street, blocking both ends so I couldn't drive away even if my van worked. They just stood there, not moving, all of them facing my direction. Some of them were smiling. Some of them had blank expressions, but all of them were watching. The woman from earlier, the one in the bathrobe, stepped forward from the line and walked up to my van again. This time she didn't knock. She just stood there and said through the glass, "Iris, we know you're scared, but there's no need to be. We're a community here and we take care of each other. We'd like you to be part of our community." How did she know my name? I hadn't told anyone my name. I yelled at her to leave me alone, to tell everyone to get away from my van, and she just shook her head sadly like I was being unreasonable. She said, "Iris, your van isn't going to start because we don't want it to start. When you're ready to come out and join us, it'll start just fine. Until then, you can sit in there as long as you like, but eventually you'll get hungry and thirsty and you'll realize that fighting us doesn't make any sense." I screamed at her that I'd already called the police and they were on their way, which was a lie, but I was desperate. She smiled and said, "Oh, honey, no, you didn't. And even if you did, they won't come. They know better." The line of people started moving closer, closing in on my van from both sides, and I grabbed my phone and actually did call 911 this time. The operator answered, and I started talking really fast, said I was trapped in my van on Ash Street in Carbondale, and there were people surrounding me, and I needed help immediately. There was a long pause, and then the operator said, "I'm sorry, did you say Ash Street?" I said, "Yes, please send someone," and she said, "Ma'am, I'm showing your location as," and then the line went dead. My phone screen showed no service, even though I'd had full bars just seconds before. I don't know how to explain what happened next without sounding completely insane, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it's the truth. The people surrounding my van all started humming, this low droning sound that wasn't quite a melody, but wasn't random either. It seemed to vibrate through the metal of the van and into my bones, and I felt this weird sensation like I was being pulled towards sleep even though I was terrified. My vision started getting blurry and I felt dizzy, and I realized that whatever they were doing, it was affecting me physically somehow. I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut and tried to focus on staying conscious, on not giving into whatever this was. I don't know how long it went on, could have been minutes, could have been an hour, but eventually the humming stopped, and when I opened my eyes, everyone was gone. The street was completely empty, like they'd all just vanished. I sat there gasping and shaking, and very slowly I reached for my keys and tried the ignition one more time. The engine roared to life immediately, like there'd never been anything wrong with it. I didn't hesitate, didn't even put on my seatbelt, just threw the van in drive and floored out of there. I drove straight through Carbondale without stopping, didn't slow down until I was on the highway heading north. And even then, I kept checking my rear view mirror expecting to see cars following me. My phone service came back once I was out of town, and I had like 15 missed calls from my friend Sarah wondering where I was. I called her back and tried to explain what happened, but I was crying and not making much sense, and she told me to just get to her place, and we'd figure it out. When I finally got to Sarah's house in New York, she took one look at me and made me take a shower and eat something before I told her the whole story. She believed me, or at least she didn't tell me I was crazy, but she also didn't really know what to make of it. She looked up Ash Street herself and found the same articles I'd found, plus a few more that I'd missed. One was a blog post from someone who claimed to have escaped from Ash Street back in 2012, and their story was almost identical to mine. Van wouldn't start, people surrounding them, weird humming, then suddenly being able to leave. The blog post said that Ash Street wasn't just a street, it was like a trap that fed on people somehow. The person didn't fully understand it, but they theorized that the people living there weren't completely human anymore, that they'd been changed by whatever presence existed on that street. And now, they lured others there to join them. The post ended with a warning to never, ever stop in Carbondale, and specifically to avoid Ash Street at all costs. The blog had been taken down shortly after being posted, but Sarah found it in an archive. I stayed with Sarah for 3 days before I felt ready to keep traveling, And during that time, I checked my van over completely to make sure nothing was wrong with it. Everything worked fine. Battery was good, starter was good, no electrical issues at all. Whatever they did to prevent it from starting, they'd undone when they decided to let me go. Or maybe I got lucky and managed to resist whatever they were trying to do to me. I don't know. What I do know is that I filed a police report with the New York State Police since the Carbondale cops seemed to be useless, and I gave them all the information I'd found about Ash Street and the missing people. The cop I spoke with said he'd pass it along to Pennsylvania authorities, but he didn't sound very optimistic that anything would come of it. He mentioned that there are places scattered around the country, usually small towns or specific streets, where weird stuff happens and nobody can really explain it. He said most law enforcement just learns to avoid those places and warn people not to stop there, but they can't exactly put up signs saying "Haunted Street, stay away." I asked him how many places like this there were, and he said more than you'd think. I still live in my van and I still travel, but I'm a lot more careful now about where I park for the night. I stick to well-lit areas. I research places before I stop there, and if something feels even slightly off, I leave immediately. I've driven through Pennsylvania a few times since then, but I take a different route that doesn't go anywhere near Carbondale. And sometimes late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I still hear that humming in my head, that low droning sound that those people made. I wonder if part of whatever they tried to do to me actually worked, if I brought something back with me from Ash Street that I'll never be able to get rid of. I wonder how many other people are out there right now, parked on streets they think are safe, with no idea what's waiting for them when the sun goes down. My name is Greg Mendoza. I'm 51 years old, and I used to live in Sacramento, California. I say used to because after my wife Linda served me with divorce papers and took basically everything in the settlement, I sold what little I had left and bought a 2004 Chevy Express cargo van off some guy for $3,000. Threw a mattress in the back, packed my clothes and tools, and just started driving with no real plan except to get away from California and all the memories there. I'd worked as an electrician for 26 years, and I figured I could pick up odd jobs wherever I ended up, live cheap in the van until I got back on my feet. I've been on the road maybe 3 weeks when I ended up in Nevada, driving through the middle of absolutely nowhere on Highway 50. They call it the loneliest road in America, and they're not kidding. I was low on gas, and the next town was still 40 miles away according to my GPS. So when I saw a sign for a place called Belmont, I took the exit even though the sign looked like it was from 1950. The road turned to dirt pretty quick and got rougher the further I went, but I kept seeing these old wooden markers pointing toward Belmont, so I figured there had to be something there. What I found was basically a ghost town, or what was left of one anyway. There were maybe 20 or 30 buildings still standing, most of them old brick or stone structures that looked like they were from the mining boom days back in the 1800s. A few of the buildings had roofs that were mostly intact, but most were just walls and empty windows. There was nobody around, no cars, no signs of life, except for some ravens perched on what used to be a church steeple. The whole place had this heavy, dead feeling to it, like the air itself was old and stale. I found what looked like it might have been the main street once, and I pulled over near this big 2-story brick building that still had Cosmopolitan Saloon painted on the side in faded letters. I got out and walked around a bit, checking out the old buildings and taking pictures with my phone, even though I had no service out there. It was actually kind of peaceful in a lonely way, and I thought maybe I'd spend the night here instead of driving all the way to the next town. Save some gas, get some sleep, no harm in that. The sun was starting to go down, and it gets cold fast in the Nevada desert once that happens, so I made myself some dinner in the van, just can chili heat it on my camp stove, and settled in for the night. I'd parked right on the old main street with my side door facing the saloon building, and through my window, I could see into some of the empty rooms where the roof had caved in. There were old bottles and trash scattered around inside, probably from teenagers or tourists who'd come out here to explore over the years. Nothing creepy about it really, just sad and abandoned. I was almost asleep, probably around 9:30 or 10, when I heard what sounded like a door slamming. I sat up and looked out my windows, but didn't see anything moving. Old buildings settle and make noise, I told myself, especially when the temperature drops at night. But then I heard it again, definitely a door, and This time I heard footsteps too. Not animal sounds, human footsteps with boots on wooden floorboards coming from somewhere nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around, but the beam didn't reach far enough to see much beyond my immediate area. I sat there listening for maybe 10 minutes and didn't hear anything else, so I convinced myself it was just my imagination or maybe some animal that sounded like footsteps. I lay back down, but I couldn't really sleep anymore, just kind of doze on and off. Around midnight, I woke up to light coming through my window, and when I looked out, I saw what looked like lantern light flickering in the windows of the saloon building across from me. Not electric light, but that warm orange glow you get from an oil lantern or candles. My first thought was that someone else had shown up, maybe some other traveler or some kids camping out in the old building. I watched the light move from one window to another on the second floor, like someone was walking around up there carrying a lantern. Then I saw a shadow pass across one of the windows, definitely a person, tall and thin, moving slow. The light stopped in what must have been a room at the front of the building, and I could see the silhouette of whoever it was just standing there looking out. Looking right at my van, actually, or at least in this direction. I waved my hand, trying to signal that I was friendly, just camping here for the night, but the figure didn't react at all. Just stood there motionless. After a few minutes, the light moved again, back through the building toward the rear, and then disappeared completely. I waited to see if it would come back, but everything stayed dark. I was wide awake now and kind of freaked out, because who camps in a falling down building when they could camp in a vehicle? And why use a lantern instead of a flashlight or headlamp like normal people? Something about the whole thing felt wrong, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Probably just some history buff or ghost hunter doing their thing. Nothing to do with me. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew it was getting light out and my neck hurt from sleeping in a weird position. I got out of the van to stretch and take a leak behind one of the buildings, and that's when I noticed there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt that hadn't been there yesterday. They came from the direction I'd driven in, looped around the Main Street area, and then headed back out the same way. Someone had driven through during the night, probably while I was asleep the first time, and I hadn't heard them at all. That seemed weird given how quiet it was out here. I walked over to the saloon building to check it out in daylight, thinking maybe I'd see evidence of whoever had been in there with the lantern. The front door was mostly rotted away and hung crooked on one hinge, and I pushed it open and stepped inside. The floor was covered in broken glass and bird droppings and chunks of plaster that had fallen from the ceiling. There was an old bar along one wall, the wood all warped and water damaged, and a staircase going up to the second floor that looked like it might collapse if you put weight on it. I didn't go upstairs, I'm not that stupid, but I looked around the ground floor and didn't see any signs of recent activity. No footprints in the dust except mine, no camping gear, no nothing. But here's what got me. On the bar there was an old glass bottle, the kind you might have found in a saloon back in the 1800s, and it looked like it had been recently placed there. The wood around it was clean, no dust, like someone had wiped that spot and set the bottle down. And inside the bottle there was a piece of paper rolled up. I picked up the bottle and pulled out the paper, which was yellowed and brittle like it was old, but the writing on it was clear. It said, 7 bells, midnight, don't be late, in handwriting that looked shaky and rushed. No signature, no date, nothing else. I stood there staring at this note, trying to figure out what it meant and who it was for, and then I heard a sound from upstairs. Not footsteps this time, more like something being dragged across the floor. Heavy and slow, scraping on the wood. I got out of that building so fast, I almost tripped over the broken door, and I stood outside breathing hard and looking up at the second floor windows. I didn't see anyone, didn't see movement, but I could still hear that dragging sound faintly through the walls. It went on for maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. I walked back to my van and sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked, trying to decide if I should just leave right now or if I was being ridiculous. It was only 7 in the morning and I'd barely slept, and the idea of driving on no sleep didn't appeal to me. I decided I'd stay until after lunch, maybe take a nap in the van during daylight hours when I felt safer, and then drive to the next town and find a proper place to park for the following night. So I made some coffee and ate some granola bars and tried to relax, but I kept watching those buildings and listening for more sounds. Around 10, and I saw movement between 2 of the structures on the far end of the street. Looked like a person walking, but I only caught a glimpse before they disappeared behind a wall. Then nothing for another hour. At noon, I was sitting in my van reading a book when I heard an engine. I looked up and saw a pickup truck coming down the dirt road into town, an old beat-up Ford from maybe the 90s. It pulled up near where I was parked, and an old man got out, probably 75 or 80 years old, wearing coveralls and a baseball cap. He walked over to my van and knocked on the window, and I rolled it down. He asked if I was having car trouble, and I said no, just camping here for the night. He got this concerned look on his face and said, "Son, you don't want to stay here after dark." I asked him why not, and he said this town's not empty like it looks. There are people here, or things that used to be people, and they don't take kindly to visitors. He said back when this was a real mining town, there was an accident at one of the mines in 1887 that killed 43 men. They were buried in a collapse and never recovered, bodies still down there under tons of rock. The mine owners tried to keep it quiet, didn't want to lose workers or investors, so they sealed the mine and never told the families what really happened. Just said the men had moved on to other camps. He said the families knew better though, and they stayed in Belmont waiting for their husbands and fathers and brothers to come back. They waited for months, then years, and eventually they started dying off themselves from hunger and sickness and grief. By 1910, the town was abandoned, except for a handful of people who refused to leave, who were convinced their loved ones were still alive somewhere in those mines. And according to local legend, some of those people are still here, still waiting, and they get angry when outsiders show up, because every stranger is a reminder that their families never came home. I told him that sounded like a ghost story, and he said, "Believe what you want, but I've lived in this area my whole life, and I know what I've seen." He said people who camp in Belmont overnight sometimes disappear, or they leave in the morning acting strange and confused with no memory of what happened to them. He said the last person who vanished was 3 years ago, a photographer from California who wanted to take pictures of the old buildings. They found his camera smashed to pieces inside the old SA office, but no sign of him. His car was still parked right where I was parked now. The old man said he had to go, but he wanted to make sure I understood the situation before he left. He said if I absolutely had to stay, I should keep my doors locked and my engine running, and if I heard 7 bells ringing at midnight, I should drive away immediately and not look back. I asked him what 7 bells meant, and he said it's a mining signal, used to mean there was a cave-in or emergency. When you heard 7 bells, you were supposed to evacuate. He said people who stayed in Belmont have heard those bells at midnight, and the ones who didn't leave right away were never seen again. After he drove off, I sat there processing everything he told me, and my rational brain was saying it's all just small-town superstition and campfire stories. But my gut was telling me to listen to him, to pack up and get out while it was still daylight. The problem was I was exhausted, and I knew if I started driving, I'd probably fall asleep at the wheel, which seemed more immediately dangerous than ghost stories. So I compromised with myself. I take a nap now while it was still afternoon, then wake up and leave before it got dark. That way I wouldn't be here overnight and I could drive safely. I set an alarm on my phone for 4 p.m., figuring that would give me a solid 3 hours of sleep and still plenty of time to get out before sunset. I locked all my doors, reclined the driver's seat, and closed my eyes. I fell asleep almost immediately and had these weird dreams about being underground in a dark tunnel, hearing men shouting and rocks falling. In the dream, I was trying to find a way out, but every passage I tried led to more darkness, more collapsed tunnels. I could hear pickaxes hitting stone somewhere far away and voices calling for help. I woke up disoriented and my phone said it was 11:47 p.m. My 4 p.m. alarm had never gone off, or if it had, I'd slept right through it. I'd been asleep for almost 12 hours, and it was now fully dark outside. And I had 13 minutes until midnight, according to that note I'd found. I turned the key to start the van and leave immediately, but just like what happened to that girl in Pennsylvania, my engine wouldn't turn over. Just clicking sounds, no power at all. My headlights wouldn't even come on. I tried it again and again, pumping the gas and turning the key, but nothing worked. I checked my phone to call for help, but of course there was no service out here. There hadn't been service since I left the highway. I was stuck in Belmont in a dead van with midnight approaching, and every instinct I had was screaming at me that I'd made a terrible mistake. I looked out my windows at the dark buildings surrounding me, and I swear I saw faces in some of the windows now, pale faces with hollow eyes watching my van. At 11:53, I heard the first sound, a deep metallic clang that echoed through the empty town. A bell, just like the old man had warned me about. I counted in my head and waited, and exactly 1 minute later, there was another bell. In another minute after that, another one. 4 bells, 5 bells, 6 bells. Each one seemed to come from a different direction, like they were surrounding me. I sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the clock on my phone, and when it hit 11:59, I heard the 7th bell. The sound seemed to vibrate through the entire van and through my body, and all the hair on my arms stood up. For about 10 seconds after the bell, everything was completely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. And then I heard them. Footsteps. Dozens of footsteps coming from all directions, boots on dirt and gravel, getting closer. I ducked down below the window level and watched through the gap between my seat and the door, and what I saw made me forget how to breathe. People were emerging from the buildings, but calling them people doesn't feel right. They looked like people, they walked like people, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Too stiff, too jerky, like their joints didn't bend properly anymore. And they were dressed in old clothes, the kind miners would have worn in the 1800s, canvas pants, suspenders, dirty shirts. Some of them were carrying lanterns and pickaxes. They gathered in the street around my van, maybe 30 or 40 of them, forming a circle, and they just stood there staring at it. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and a hat, walked up to my driver's side window and peered in. His eyes were wrong, too dark, like the pupils had expanded to fill the whole eye, and his skin had this grayish tint to it. He raised his fist and knocked on the window 3 times, slow and deliberate, and said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, "You received the summons." "Why do you hide?" I didn't answer, didn't move, just stayed crouched there hoping he couldn't actually see me in the darkness. He knocked again and said, "We ring the bells for those who are called. You were called. Come out and join us. We've been waiting for you." The way he said it, "waiting for you," made it sound like they'd known I was coming, like this was all planned. I whispered no, "Leave me alone," and his expression didn't change at all. He said, "The ones who refuse the calling don't leave this place. They become part of the earth, like our brothers in the mine. Is that what you want?" The other figures started moving closer, pressing in around the van, and I could hear their hands touching the metal, scraping against it. Some of them were looking in the windows now, their faces inches from the glass, and I could see that several of them had injuries, crushed limbs, caved-in skulls, bodies that looked like they'd been caught in a cave-in and never healed. These were the miners who died in 1887, or whatever was left of them, and they wanted me to join them in whatever existence they were trapped in. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed one of my work tools from the back, a big wrench, and I smashed out my back window. The glass shattered and cold air rushed in, and I squeezed through the opening, cutting my arms on the remaining glass, but not caring. I hit the ground running, sprinting away from the van and the circle of miners, heading toward the edge of town where the desert started. I could hear them behind me, not running, but walking steadily, their footsteps keeping pace with mine somehow, even though I was moving faster. I ran for what felt like miles through the sagebrush and rocks, tripping and falling and getting back up until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. I looked back and saw the lights of Belmont in the distance, the lanterns still glowing, and I could see the silhouettes of the miners standing at the edge of town watching me. They didn't follow me into the desert, just watched, and eventually the lights started fading one by one until everything was dark again. I walked through the desert all night, using the stars to navigate east toward where I thought the highway might be. My phone was dead, and I had no water, and my arms were bleeding from the glass. But I kept walking because I knew if I stopped I might not start again. When the sun came up, I could see the highway in the distance, maybe 2 miles away, and I walked toward it like it was salvation. A trucker eventually picked me up when I flagged him down, said I looked half dead, and asked what happened. I told him my van broke down and I had to walk out, didn't mention anything about the miners. He drove me to the nearest town, a place called Eureka, and dropped me at a gas station. I used their phone to call a tow company and told them my van was in Belmont and needed to be recovered. The dispatcher asked me to repeat the location, and when I said Belmont again, she said they don't service that area anymore. Too dangerous and too many vehicles have been damaged or lost trying to pull people out of there. She recommended I call the county sheriff instead and file a report. The sheriff's deputy who took my statement seemed completely unsurprised by my story, which should have made me feel better, but actually made it worse. He said they get calls about Belmont a few times a year, people camping there and experiencing strange things or having their vehicles sabotaged. He said the county has tried to block off the access road multiple times, but people keep clearing the barriers. When I asked if they could go get my van, he said they'd send someone out to take a look, but no guarantees, and if my van was still there, it probably wouldn't be in drivable condition anymore. They never recovered my van, and I never got it back. According to the deputy who called me 2 weeks later, they sent a unit out to Belmont and found my van right where I'd left it, but the entire engine had been stripped out. Not stolen, just dismantled piece by piece and scattered around the inside of the vehicle like someone had taken it apart with their bare hands. The seats were shredded and the windows I hadn't broken were smashed from the inside. He said it looked like wild animals had gotten in there, but they both knew it wasn't animals. I'm living in a different van now, bought it with what little money I had left after the divorce, and I stick to major cities and well-populated areas. I don't camp in ghost towns, I don't follow dirt roads to abandoned places, and I definitely don't ignore warnings from old men who tell me to leave before dark. Sometimes I still have those dreams about being underground, hearing the pickaxes and the voices calling for help, and I wake up convinced I can smell dust and oil and sweat. I looked up the 1887 mining accident the old man mentioned, and it's real. 43 men died in a collapse at the Belmont mine, and their bodies were never recovered. The newspaper from that year said the families waited for months, and some of them died in the town, never knowing what happened to their loved ones. I think about those miners every time I park my van for the night, and I wonder how many of them are still waiting there in that dead town, ringing their bells at midnight, hoping someone will finally answer the summons and join them in the darkness where they've been trapped for over 100 years. My name is Tasha Brennan. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Tucson, Arizona, or at least that's where my mail goes now, since I don't really have a permanent address anymore. I've been living in my van for about 7 months, a 2010 Toyota Sienna that I converted myself with some plywood and foam. It's not fancy, but it works, and after losing my job as a dental hygienist and getting evicted from my apartment all in the same month, it was either this or move back in with my parents in Ohio, which wasn't happening. I was driving through New Mexico in early November, heading from Tucson up to Santa Fe to visit a friend from college, and I'd been on the road for maybe 4 hours when I started getting really tired. I'd left early that morning thinking I'd make good time, but I'd stopped for lunch and then got stuck behind road construction for like an hour. So by the time I got near this little town called Mountain Air, it was already getting dark and I was exhausted. I saw a sign for a rest area about 2 miles ahead and figured I'd pull in there, maybe sleep for a few hours before finishing the drive. The rest area was small, just a parking lot with maybe 10 spaces, a couple picnic tables, and one of those informational kiosks with maps and brochures about local attractions. There was only one other vehicle there when I pulled in, an older Winnebago that looked like it had seen better days. The lights were on inside, and I could see someone moving around, which made me feel a little better about stopping. At least I wasn't completely alone out here. I parked a few spaces away from the RV, locked my doors, and climbed in the back to make some dinner. I was heating up a can of soup on my little propane stove when someone knocked on my window. It was a woman, maybe late 40s, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and a friendly smile. She waved at me, and I cracked the window a couple inches. She said, "Hi there, just wanted to check if you're okay. Saw you pull in and wanted to make sure you're not having car trouble." I told her no, I'm fine, just taking a break before I keep driving. She introduced herself as Kelly and said she and her husband Dave were in the RV over there, been traveling for a few years now, doing the full-time RV thing. We chatted for a minute through the window, just small talk about where I was heading and how long I'd been on the road, normal conversation. She seemed nice enough, not pushy or weird, just friendly. She mentioned that if I needed anything, water, food, company, I should feel free to come knock on their door. I thanked her and said I was good, and she smiled and walked back to her RV. I finished my soup and was getting ready to try and sleep when I noticed another vehicle pull into the rest area, a white panel van with no windows in the back. Two men got out of the panel van, both of them probably in their 30s or 40s, and they didn't even glance at my vehicle. They walked straight over to Kelly and Dave's RV and knocked on the door. Kelly opened it and they went inside, and I could hear voices but not what they were saying. Not my business really, probably just friends meeting up or something. I settled into my sleeping bag and tried to get comfortable, but something about the whole situation was giving me a weird feeling that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I was almost asleep when I heard more vehicles pulling in, and I lifted my head to look out the window. There were now two more cars in the parking lot, a sedan and a pickup truck, and people were getting out and heading over to the RV, just like the guys from the panel van had done. This was starting to feel less like a coincidence and more like some kind of meeting or gathering, and I wondered if maybe this rest area was a regular meetup spot for some group. Maybe a traveling club or something, I don't know. The voices from the RV were getting louder now, not angry, but excited like people at a party. I could hear laughter and music playing, and part of me relaxed thinking, okay, it's just people hanging out, nothing sinister about that. But the other part of me was still uneasy, especially when I counted the vehicles and realized there were now at least 10 or 12 people crammed into that RV. That seemed like way too many people for the size of it, and I couldn't figure out why they'd all meet here at a random rest area instead of someone's house or a campground. Around 9 o'clock, the door to the RV opened and everyone started coming out, and that's when I got a better look at them. There were maybe 8 or 9 people total, ranging from their 20s to their 50s, all dressed pretty casually. They stood around in the parking lot talking and smoking cigarettes, and every so often one of them would glance over at my van. Not staring, just quick looks, but it was enough to make me nervous. I ducked down lower in my sleeping bag so they couldn't see me watching them. After about 10 minutes of this, Kelly broke away from the group and started walking toward my van again. She knocked on the window, and I pretended to be asleep for a second, but she knocked again and said, "Tasha, you awake?" The fact that she remembered my name from one short conversation earlier felt weird, but I sat up and cracked the window. She said, "Hey, we're having a little get-together, and we'd love for you to join us." I said, "No thanks, I'm pretty tired, just want to sleep." She said, "Are you sure? We've got food and drinks, it'll be fun." There was something about the way she said it that felt more like pressure than invitation, and I told her again that I was good. "Thanks anyway." She stood there for a second, looking at me with this expression that was hard to read. Then she said, "Well, if you change your mind, we'll be right over there." She walked back to the group, and they all started talking quietly, glancing at my van again, and I saw one of the men from the panel van shake his head like he disagreed with something. Then they all split up and got back in their vehicles. I thought they were leaving, which made me feel relieved, but instead, they just repositioned their vehicles. The panel van moved to one side of my van, the sedan to the other side, and the pickup truck pulled in behind me. They were boxing me in, and when I tried to start my engine to move before they completely blocked me, my van wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, just sputtered and died. I tried it 3 more times with the same result, and I started to panic because this was the exact same thing that had happened to those other people in the stories I'd heard. Kelly came back over, and this time she didn't knock. She just stood outside my window and said, "Having car trouble?" Her voice was different now, less friendly and more businesslike. I said my van won't start and I need to call a tow truck, and she said, "Well, that's going to be difficult since there's no cell service out here," which I already knew, but hearing her say it made it feel more threatening somehow. She said, "Why don't you come out and we'll take a look at your engine? Maybe it's something simple we can fix." I knew that was a bad idea, knew I shouldn't open my door, but I also knew I couldn't just sit in the van forever. So I grabbed my phone and my keys and climbed out, keeping my distance from Kelly and the others who were now standing near their vehicles watching. One of the men from the panel van, a tall guy with a shaved head and tattoos on his arms, said, "Pop your hood and let's see what's going on." I hesitated, but eventually did it, and he spent maybe 2 minutes looking at the engine before he said, "Yeah, looks like your fuel pump's dead. You're not going anywhere tonight." I asked how he could tell that so quickly, and he just shrugged and said, "I know engines." Kelly said, "Well, since you're stuck here anyway, you might as well come join us for a bit." We got a generator running in the RV. It's warm, much better than sitting in a coal vent all night. I said I'd rather just stay in my van, and the tall guy said suit yourself, but it's going to get down to freezing tonight, and I don't think your battery's going to last long enough to run your heater all night. He was right about that. My van's heater sucked, and I usually had to bundle up in multiple layers to stay warm. I stood there trying to figure out what to do, and that's when another woman from the group spoke up. She was younger, maybe mid-20s with dark hair and a nose ring. And she said, "Look, I know this probably seems weird, but we're not trying to hurt you or anything. We're just travelers like you, and we look out for each other. This rest area is kind of a meeting spot for people who live on the road, people who need help or supplies, or just company. We're offering to share what we have with you. That's all." The way she said it sounded so reasonable, so normal, that I almost believed her. Almost. But there was still something off about the whole situation, about how they'd all shown up at the same time, and how my van had conveniently died right when they blocked me in. I said, "Okay, I'll come hang out for a little bit, but then I want to sleep," and Kelly smiled and said, "Of course, whatever you're comfortable with." She put her hand on my shoulder like we were friends and guided me toward the RV. Inside the RV, it was cramped and hot, with way too many people in too small a space. There was a fold-out table in the middle with food spread out on it, crackers and cheese, and some kind of casserole, and people were sitting on the built-in benches or standing wherever there was room. Dave, Kelly's husband, was a big guy with a beard who was mixing drinks at a little counter. He handed me a red plastic cup with something that smelled like whiskey and cola, and said, "Here, this'll warm you up." I took it, but didn't drink it, just held it while Kelly introduced me to everyone. The names all blurred together: Mike and Sarah, Jessica, Chris, some others I didn't catch, and they all seemed friendly enough. They asked me the usual questions about where I was from and where I was going, and I gave vague answers because I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. After about 15 minutes of small talk, Kelly said, "So, Tasha, what do you think about community? Do you think people are stronger when they work together or when they work alone?" It was such a random question that I didn't know how to answer at first. I said, "I guess it depends on the situation," and she nodded like that was profound or something. Then she said, "The thing about living on the road is that you're vulnerable out here by yourself. People could take advantage of you, hurt you, rob you, and nobody would even know. But if you have a community, people who watch out for you and you watch out for them, you're so much safer. Don't you think that makes sense?" I agreed that it made sense in theory, but I was getting this cult vibe from the whole conversation and I wanted to leave. Dave chimed in and said that's why we formed this group, this network of travelers who help each other out. We've got people all over the Southwest, all over the country really, and we communicate through apps and forums, and we meet up at designated spots like this rest area. If someone needs mechanical help or food or money or a place to stay, the community provides it. It sounded almost wholesome the way he described it, but then he said, of course, being part of the community means contributing to the community. Everyone has to give something. I asked what kind of contributions he meant, and Kelly said, "Oh, different things depending on what someone has to offer. Some people are good at mechanical work, so they fix vehicles. Some people are good at cooking, so they prepare food for gatherings. Some people are good at finding resources, scavenging, shoplifting, scamming, whatever works. And some people are good at recruiting, at finding new members who would benefit from joining us." She looked right at me when she said that last part. The tall guy with the tattoos, whose name I learned was Marcus, said, "We've been watching you since you pulled in. We can tell you're struggling, probably don't have much money, living in that little van all alone. You're exactly the kind of person who would benefit from having a support system." I said, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm fine on my own. I'm just passing through anyway." Kelly laughed and said, "Nobody's ever just passing through, honey. You're out here because you don't have anywhere else to be, same as the rest of us." That hit a little too close to home, and I felt my face get hot. I said I really should go. I'm tired and I want to get some sleep. I stood up, but Marcus blocked the door, not aggressively, but definitely intentionally. He said, "We haven't finished our conversation yet. We need to know if you're interested in joining the community, because if you're not, well, that creates a problem for us." I asked what kind of problem, and the room got really quiet. Everyone was looking at me now with these serious expressions. Kelly said, "The problem is that you know about this place, about our network. If you leave and tell people about it, tell the police, or post about it online, or whatever, it could cause trouble for a lot of people who depend on this system. So we need some kind of assurance that you're either going to join us or you're going to keep quiet about what you've seen here. I said, I don't even know what I've seen, just a bunch of people hanging out at a rest area. There's nothing illegal about that. Dave said you'd be surprised what people consider suspicious these days. I said, absolutely not. I'm not robbing anyone. And Kelly sighed like I was being difficult. She said it's not robbing, it's redistributing resources from someone who has plenty to people who need it. This guy's got a $50,000 truck and all the best camping equipment. He's clearly doing fine. We're just going to take what we need and leave. You won't even know who did it. I said, I don't care how you justify it. I'm not doing it, and I need to leave now. I pushed past Marcus toward the door, and he grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop me. Dave said, let her go. She's not ready yet. Marcus released my arm, and I stumbled out of the RV into the cold night air, practically running back to my van. I climbed inside and locked all the doors, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I tried the engine again, and it still wouldn't start, and I wanted to scream from frustration and fear. Through my window, I could see them all standing outside the RV watching me, talking amongst themselves. Kelly waved at me with that same friendly smile from earlier. I tried to think of a plan, some way to get out of the situation. I couldn't call for help because there was no signal. I couldn't drive because my van was dead and blocked in by their vehicles. I couldn't run on foot because we were in the middle of nowhere and it was freezing outside. I was trapped, and these people clearly weren't going to let me leave until I either joined their group or they figured out some other way to keep me quiet. I wondered what that other way might be, and I didn't let myself think about it too much. Around 10:30, I saw them loading into the panel van and the pickup truck, getting ready to go rob that camper Marcus had shown me the photo of. Kelly came over to my van one more time and said, last chance to come with us. Show us you're one of us. I shook my head and she said, okay, have it your way. We'll be back in a couple hours and then we'll figure out what to do with you. The way she said it made my blood run cold. She walked away and both vehicles drove out of the rest area, leaving just me and Dave in the RV. I waited about 20 minutes to make sure they were really gone. Then I quietly opened my door and crept over to Dave's RV. The lights were still on inside, and I could see him sitting at the table doing something on a laptop. I knocked softly, and he opened the door, looking surprised to see me. I said, Dave, I need your help, please. I'll do whatever you want. I'll join your group. Just please help me get my van started so I can prove I'm useful. He studied my face for a long moment and then nodded and said, okay, come in. He closed the door behind me and offered me a seat, and I sat down trying to look compliant and cooperative even though my heart was pounding. He said, you know, most people who end up in your situation make the smart choice eventually. The community isn't as bad as you're imagining. We really do help each other, and yes, sometimes it means bending the rules a little bit, but nobody gets hurt. I nodded and said, I understand that now. I was just scared before. He said, that's natural, but you seem like a smart girl. I'm sure you'll fit in fine. He went to a drawer and pulled out a small plastic bag with what looked like pills in it. And he said, here, take one of these. It'll help you relax and feel more connected to the group. I looked at the pills and knew there was no way I was taking whatever that was. I said, can I use your bathroom first? And he pointed to a tiny door at the back of the RV. I went in and locked the door behind me, and I looked around frantically for anything I could use. There was a small window above the toilet that looked like it might be big enough to squeeze through. I climbed onto the toilet and pushed the window open as quietly as I could, and I could hear Dave outside asking if I was okay in there. I said, yeah, just a minute, and I pulled myself up and squeezed through the window, scraping my stomach on the frame, but getting through. I dropped onto the ground outside and started running toward the road. I heard Dave yelling behind me and the RV door slamming open, but I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could. I made it to the highway and stuck my thumb out, praying someone would stop. A semi-truck came around a bend, and I waved my arms frantically, and thank God he slowed down and pulled over. I climbed into the cab, and the driver, an older Hispanic man, asked what the hell I was doing out here in the middle of the night. I was crying and could barely talk, but I managed to say, please just drive, please get me out of here. He looked concerned, but put the truck in gear, and we pulled back onto the highway. I looked back through the mirror and saw Dave standing in the rest area parking lot watching us drive away. He had his phone to his ear, probably calling Kelly and the others to let them know I'd escaped. The truck driver took me to the next town, a place called Willard, and dropped me at a gas station. I used their phone to call the state police and reported everything. The group, the rest area, the plan to rob the camper, all of it. The officer who took my report said they'd send someone to check it out, but when they got there an hour later, the rest area was empty. No RV, no vehicles, no people. Just my van sitting there with the hood still up. The police gave me a ride back to my van, and mechanic they called checked the engine. He found that someone had disconnected a wire to the fuel pump, simple as that. And once he reconnected it, the van started fine. The officer asked if I wanted to file charges against anyone, but I didn't know their last names or license plate numbers or anything specific enough to identify them. He said this wasn't the first report they'd gotten about suspicious activity at that rest area, and they were going to start patrolling it more regularly. I drove straight to Santa Fe that night. Didn't stop until I got to my friend's house, and I told her everything that happened. She let me stay with her for a week while I recovered, and during that time, I searched online for any information about traveling groups or networks like the one Kelly had described. I found a few forum posts from other vanlifers warning about certain rest areas and truck stops where people had experienced similar situations, being approached by overly friendly locals, having their vehicles sabotaged, being pressured to join some kind of community or collective. One post specifically mentioned the Mountain Air Rest area in New Mexico and described almost exactly what happened to me, right down to Kelly and Dave's names. The person who wrote it said they barely escaped, and when they reported it to police, the group had already cleared out. Someone else replied, saying these groups operate all over the country, targeting vulnerable solo travelers, and once you're in you can't get out because they know too much about you. I don't know if that's true or just paranoia, but it was enough to make me change how I travel. I don't park at rest areas anymore, period. I stick to Walmarts and truck stops and established campgrounds where there are security cameras and lots of witnesses. I don't talk to strangers who approach my van, and I definitely don't accept invitations to join any communities or networks no matter how friendly they seem. And every time I see a white panel van or an older Winnebago, I get this spike of anxiety wondering if it's them, if they're still out there looking for me because I got away and I know their secrets. I tell myself I'm being paranoid, that they've probably moved on to other rest areas and other victims, but sometimes late at night I'll hear a knock on my van and my whole body will freeze up, convinced it's Kelly standing outside with that smile asking if I've changed my mind about joining them. My name is Carl Du Bois. I'm 47 years old, and I live in Boise, Idaho, or I did until about 4 months ago when I decided I'd had enough of regular life and bought myself a beat-up 1999 Dodge Ram with a camper shell in the back. I'm a carpenter by trade, been doing it for 23 years, and after my divorce from Rachel went through and my kids moved to Oregon with her, I just didn't see the point in staying put anymore. So I loaded up my tools and clothes and hit the road, picking up odd jobs here and there to pay for gas and food. I've been wandering around Idaho and Montana for a couple months, mostly staying in national forest land where you can camp for free, when I heard about this area up near the Canadian border called the Selkirk Mountains. Guy I met at a lumber yard in Coeur d'Alene told me it was beautiful up there, hardly anyone around, perfect for someone who wanted to get away from people for a while. That sounded exactly like what I needed. So I headed north on Highway 95 until I got to this tiny town called Bonner's Ferry, then kept going on Forest Service roads into the mountains. The further I drove, the worse the roads got, from paved to gravel to dirt to barely there tracks that I wasn't sure my truck could handle. But I kept pushing because I wanted to get as far from civilization as possible, wanted to be somewhere I couldn't hear traffic or see other people's lights at night. After about 2 hours of rough driving, I came across what looked like an old logging camp that had been abandoned probably 20 or 30 years ago. There were a few dilapidated buildings, rusted equipment scattered around, and a clearing that would have been perfect for parking. I pulled in and set up camp, which for me just meant opening the camper shell and rolling out my sleeping bag. I got a cooler for food, a camp stove for cooking, and a few lanterns for light. Nothing fancy, but it's all I need. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was up there. Not peaceful quiet, more like oppressive quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds chirping, no wind in the trees, just silence. I figured maybe it was the time of year or the elevation or something. Didn't think too much about it at first. I spent the rest of that day just relaxing, drinking beer, and reading a book I'd picked up at a thrift store. As the sun started going down, I made myself some dinner, just hot dogs and beans, and sat outside watching the light fade through the trees. That's when I started feeling like I was being watched. You know that sensation you get when someone's staring at you even though you can't see them? I kept looking around at the tree line, but didn't see anything, just darkness gathering between the trunks. I told myself I was being paranoid, that being alone in the woods was messing with my head. Around 8 o'clock it was fully dark, and I climbed into the back of my truck to sleep. I've got this system where I can lock the camper shell from the inside. Makes me feel safer, even though realistically, if a bear wanted to get in it, probably could. I was just dozing off when I heard footsteps outside, crunching on the gravel and dead leaves. Heavy footsteps, definitely human, not animal. I froze and listened, and whoever was walked completely around my truck, slow and deliberate, like they were inspecting it. Then the footsteps stopped right by the tailgate. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, just laid there in my sleeping bag listening. After maybe a full minute of silence, I heard a man's voice say, "I know you're in there." It was quiet but clear, and it sounded old, rough like the guy had been smoking his whole life. I didn't respond. Figure maybe if I stayed quiet, he'd think he was wrong and leave. But then he said, "Saw your truck come up the mountain this afternoon. Don't get many visitors up here anymore." The way he said it didn't sound threatening exactly, more like he was stating a fact, but it still scared the hell out of me. I finally said, "Who are you? What do you want?" And there was a long pause before he answered. He said, "Name's Walter. I live up here. Just came by to see who you were, make sure you weren't causing trouble." I asked what kind of trouble, and he said the kind that disturbs things that shouldn't be disturbed. That was a weird answer, and I didn't know what to say to it. I asked if he lived in one of these old buildings, and he said no, he had a place further up the mountain. He said I should probably move on in the morning, that this wasn't a good place to camp. I asked why not, and he didn't answer right away. Then he said, "People who stay here too long end up regretting it." Last fellow who camped here, maybe 6 months ago, he stayed 3 nights, and by the 3rd night, he was screaming. Had to help him get down the mountain. Poor bastard couldn't even drive anymore. I said what happened to him, and Walter said, "Same thing that happens to everyone who stays. This camp's got a history. Bad things happened here back in the 80s, and the place remembers. Now you seem like a decent guy, so I'm giving you fair warning. Pack up at first light and find somewhere else." I heard his footsteps walking away, crunching through the undergrowth, getting quieter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I laid there for probably an hour trying to decide if I should just leave right now in the dark, but I've driven these mountain roads, and doing it at night seemed more dangerous than whatever Walter was warning me about. So I decided I'd wait until morning like he said, get a few hours of sleep, and then move on. I wasn't going to stay somewhere I wasn't welcome anyway. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up to sunlight coming through the camper shell windows. It was probably around 7 in the morning, and I felt like I'd barely slept at all. I climbed out of the truck to take a leak and make some coffee, and that's when I noticed the marks. There were footprints all around my truck, dozens of them, way more than just one person walking around. And they weren't fresh prints from this morning. They were in the dew that had formed overnight, which meant they'd been made hours ago while I was sleeping. I counted at least 5 or 6 different sets of prints, different sizes, circling my truck over and over like people had been walking around it all night. Some of the prints came right up to the tailgate and then turned around like they'd gotten close and then backed away. I felt sick looking at them, imagining all these people surrounding my truck in the dark while I was unconscious and vulnerable. I immediately started packing up my stuff, throwing everything in the truck bed without even organizing it properly. That's when I saw the building. One of the old logging camp structures. A long rectangular building that looked like it might have been the bunkhouse where workers slept. The door was open. I was sure it had been closed yesterday, and I could see scratches on the door frame like someone had pried it open recently. I didn't want to look inside, but I couldn't help myself. Some morbid curiosity pulled me toward it. I walked over and peered through the doorway into the dim interior. The inside of the bunkhouse was trashed, with old mattresses torn apart and graffiti covering the walls. But what caught my attention was the back wall, where someone had written the same phrase over and over in what looked like charcoal or maybe dry blood. "They're still here," written maybe 30 or 40 times, covering the entire wall from floor to ceiling. And below that, scratched into the wood, were tally marks. I counted them, 63 marks total, grouped in sets of 5, like someone counting days. I backed out of that building and practically ran to my truck, ready to get the hell out of there. But when I turned the key, my engine made a grinding sound and wouldn't start. The battery was fine, the starter was engaging, but the engine just wouldn't catch. I tried it 5 or 6 times and nothing. I popped the hood to check and everything looked normal. No disconnected wires or obvious problems. I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough about engines to tell when something's seriously wrong versus just a minor issue. And this didn't make sense. I was standing there staring at the engine, trying to figure out what to do when I heard voices. Multiple voices coming from the woods on the east side of the camp. They were talking to each other, but I couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm of conversation. I looked toward the tree line and saw movement, people walking through the forest, maybe 4 or 5 of them, heading toward the camp. I ducked behind my truck and watched them emerge from the trees. They were men, all of them, ranging from probably 30 to 60 years old. They were dressed in work clothes, flannel shirts, and jeans and boots, and they were carrying tools. Axes and saws and things I didn't recognize. They walked into the camp like they owned it, talking and laughing, and headed straight for one of the other buildings. They went inside, and I could hear banging and scraping sounds, like they were working on something. This went on for maybe 20 minutes while I crouched behind my truck, trying to stay hidden. Eventually, they came back out and walked right past my truck. I mean, within 10 feet of where I was hiding, and none of them seemed to notice me at all. They were still talking to each other, something about quotas and schedules, and the boss being angry. One of them said they needed to work faster or there'd be consequences. They walked back into the forest the same direction they'd come from, and their voices faded away until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed hidden for another few minutes to make sure they were really gone. Then I stood up and looked at the building they'd been working in. The door was open now, and I could see fresh sawdust on the ground near the entrance, like they'd actually been cutting wood in there. But that didn't make sense because this camp had been abandoned for decades. There was no reason for anyone to be logging here now, and certainly not with hand tools like they were using. Unless I'd just hallucinated the whole thing, which honestly seemed more likely than what I'd seen. I tried my truck again, and this time it started right up, no problem at all. I didn't question it, just threw it in reverse and started backing out of the camp. That's when I saw Walter standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was older than I'd imagined from his voice, probably 75 or 80, with white hair and a weathered face. He was holding a walking stick, and he looked sad more than anything else. He said, "You should have left last night when I told you to. Now you've seen them, and they've seen you." I stopped the truck and rolled down my window, asked him what he meant. He walked closer and said, "Those men you saw, they worked this camp back in 1983. There was an accident. A tree fell wrong and crushed the bunkhouse while they were sleeping. Killed 11 men, trapped 3 others who died slow over a couple days before anyone could dig them out. The logging company shut down the camp after that, said it was cursed, and nobody's worked here since." I said that's impossible. Those men I just saw were alive. They were talking and working. He shook his head and said they think they're alive. They don't know they're dead. They come back every day and work their shifts, same as they did 40 years ago. I told him he was crazy, that what he was saying didn't make sense, and he said, "You think I don't know how it sounds? I've been living up here for 15 years, trying to keep people away from this place, trying to warn them, and nobody ever listens. The ones who stay too long end up like you. They start seeing the workers, hearing them at night, and eventually the workers notice them back. Once that happens, once you're seen, they start trying to recruit you. They need help meeting their quotas, and they don't understand why living people won't join their crew." He said the man he'd mentioned last night, the one who stayed 3 nights, by the end he was hearing voices constantly telling him to pick up an axe and get to work. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, just walked around the camp trying to find where the voices were coming from. Walter found him on the morning of the fourth day, trying to chop down a tree with his bare hands, his fingers all bloody and broken. He said it took 3 men to get him restrained and down the mountain to a hospital, and as far as he knew, the guy was still in some psychiatric facility trying to recover. I asked Walter why he stayed here if it was so dangerous, and he said someone had to keep watch, make sure people didn't accidentally wander in and get hurt. He said he knew how to avoid the workers, knew their schedules, and when to stay inside, and when it was safe to move around. He made his peace with sharing the mountain with ghosts or whatever they were. I told him I was leaving right now and never coming back. And he said, "Good, but I'll warn you, they know you now. They might follow you in your head for a while, try to call you back. Don't listen to them. And whatever you do, don't come back up here. If you do, next time I might not be around to help you leave." I drove out of that camp faster than I should have on those terrible roads, bouncing and scraping the undercarriage of my truck, but not caring. I just wanted distance between me and that place. I made it back to Bonner's Ferry in about half the time it took to drive up, and I didn't stop until I found a diner where I could sit and have coffee and be around normal people doing normal things. I tried to convince myself that Walter was just a crazy old hermit, and what I'd seen was just local workers doing some kind of maintenance. Nothing supernatural about it. But over the next few days, I started hearing things. Voices faint and distant, like they were coming from far away or maybe from inside my own head. They'd say things like, "We need you back at camp," or "There's work to be done," or "You're part of the crew now." At first, it was just during quiet moments, but then it started happening even when I was around other people or listening to the radio. The voices would cut through whatever other sound there was, clear as day, and I'd look around expecting to see someone talking to me, but there'd be nobody there. I went to a doctor in Sandpoint and told him I was hearing voices, and he asked if I had a history of mental illness or drug use. I said no, and he prescribed me some antipsychotic medication, said it might be stress-induced psychosis from the divorce and all the changes in my life. I took the pills for a week, and they helped a little bit, made the voices quieter, but they never went away completely. And I started having dreams about the logging camp, about working there alongside those men, cutting trees and hauling lumber and laughing with them like we were all friends. The dreams got worse and more vivid until I was having trouble telling them apart from reality. I'd wake up in my truck with sawdust under my fingernails, even though I hadn't been anywhere near wood. I'd find splinters in my hands that I didn't remember getting. One morning, I woke up and my hands were blistered like I'd been swinging an axe all night, but the last thing I remembered was going to sleep in a Walmart parking lot in Coeur d'Alene. The medication wasn't working, and I was starting to think maybe I actually was losing my mind. I decided to go back to Boise, stay with my brother for a while until I could get my head straight. But the closer I got to Boise, the louder the voices became, and they were angry now. They kept saying I'd abandoned my crew, that I had responsibilities, that I needed to come back and finish my shift. I was on I-90 heading south when I suddenly found myself pulling off at an exit I didn't recognize, turning onto back roads that led north instead of south. I tried to turn around, but my hands wouldn't obey me. They just kept steering toward the mountains. I drove for hours in this weird, fugue state, aware of what was happening, but unable to stop it, until I ended up back on that same Forest Service road leading to the logging camp. That's when I finally managed to slam on the brakes, and I just sat there in the middle of the road with the engine running, trying to fight whatever was controlling me. The voices were screaming now, demanding I continue, and I could feel this overwhelming compulsion to drive forward. I was about to give in when I saw Walter standing in the road ahead of me. He walked up to my window and said, "I was afraid this would happen. They got their hooks in you good." I asked him how to make it stop, and he said there was only one way. I had to go back to the camp one more time and confront them directly, tell them I wasn't dead and I wasn't part of their crew and they had no claim on me. He said it wouldn't be easy, that they'd try to convince me to stay, but if I could resist them and make it through one night, they'd lose their hold on me. I asked what happened if I couldn't resist, and he said, "Then you become like them, a ghost working an eternal shift that never ends." I didn't have much choice at that point, so I drove to the camp with Walter following behind his old pickup truck. We got there just as the sun was setting, and I could already see the workers emerging from the forest. There were more of them this time, maybe 15 or 20, all carrying their tools and heading toward the buildings. Walter told me to stay in my truck with the doors locked until they acknowledged me directly, and then I need to face them. For the first hour, they ignored me, just went about their work like I wasn't there. But around 9 o'clock, one of them, a younger guy with a beard, came over and knocked on my window. He said, "New guy's here, boss wants to talk to you." I looked at Walter and he nodded, so I opened the door and got out. The bearded guy led me to the bunkhouse, the same one with all the writing on the walls, and inside there was a man sitting at a makeshift desk made from old crates. He was older, maybe 60 when he died, and he had this air of authority about him. He said, "You're the one who's been avoiding work. That's not acceptable. We've got quotas to meet and you're behind schedule." I said, "I don't work for you. I'm not dead. I'm alive and I'm leaving." He looked at me like I'd said something stupid and said, "Son, look around. You're here, same as us. That makes you part of the crew, whether you accept it or not. Now you can make this easy and get to work, or you can make it hard and we'll have to convince you." The other workers had gathered around the bunkhouse, and I could see them through the windows, all watching me. Walter was still in his truck outside, and I could see him mouthing something, but I couldn't hear him. The boss stood up and said, "What's it going to be?" And I realized he wasn't asking me to make a choice. He was telling me there was no choice. He expected me to pick up an axe and join them, and if I refused, they'd find a way to make me. I ran, just bolted out of that bunkhouse and sprinted for my truck, and I heard shouting behind me and footsteps chasing me. I got to my truck and jumped in and started the engine, and this time it roared to life immediately. I threw it in reverse and floored it, nearly hitting several of the workers who were trying to block my path. Walter's truck was right behind me, and we both raced down that mountain road as fast as we dared in the dark. I didn't stop driving until I was all the way back in Bonner's Ferry, and Walter followed me to the same diner I'd been to before. We sat down, and he said, "You did good. You faced them and you ran, which is the smart thing to do. They can't follow you off the mountain. Their territory ends at the tree line." I asked if the voices would stop now, and he said they should, that by rejecting them directly, I'd broken their claim on me. He was right. Over the next few days, the voices faded and the dreams stopped, and I started feeling like myself again. I sold my truck and camper shell a week later and used the money to rent an apartment in Coeur d'Alene. I got a job at a cabinet shop and started trying to live a normal life again. I still think about those workers sometimes, wonder if they're still up there on that mountain going through the motions of their jobs, not knowing they died 40 years ago. Wonder if Walter's still watching over them, keeping other travelers away from the camp. I looked at the accident he'd mentioned, and it's real. 11 men died in a bunkhouse collapse at a logging camp in the Stalkers in 1983, exactly like he said. I don't camp anymore, don't even like being in the woods. I stick to cities now, where there are plenty of people and lights and noise, where the only voices I hear are from living people who know they're alive. And sometimes on quiet nights I'll think I hear someone calling my name from far away, telling me there's work to be done and I need to come back. But I don't listen. I learned my lesson about seeking isolation in the wrong places, about what happens when you disturb things that should be left alone. Some places hold onto their history too tight, and some people never stop working even after death steals everything else from them.